That's my way of saying everyone is out to get it. So, the myth is, so the lost cause myth is, therefore, the war was for a noble cause to defend states' rights, and therefore the whole goal of Northern aggression in the Civil War was to invade in Reconstruction. And that is the Reconstruction myth. And it's going to be quite pervasive after the war, all over the United States. In fact, this will become the norm. That's going to be taught that Reconstruction was a failure, and it was a part of the Northern desire for revenge and even invasion. And therefore, Reconstruction was never really an effort at equal rights. It was just a way to dominate and punish and destroy the South. I got to be very clear about it. Reconstruction made mistakes. There were flaws, especially in the areas of compensation for former slaves, let alone what's going to happen to them afterwards, financial issues, you name it. But they did try to bring equal rights. That is an absolute fact. But what really at the Reconstruction myth was going into the 20th century, as the lost cause myth grew more and more, would be a movie called The Birth of a Nation. 1913, probably the first real motion picture that set up the whole, what we think of a movie, how plots are organized, the set, a feature-length movie from the beginning, the way the story is, a couple turns, twists at the end, and then the conclusion. I don't know why I walked over there and did it, but I did. This would be established by Birth of the Nation, the first modern movie. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's really good. A couple years ago, we watched it in Special Topics. I might do that again. It's a pretty amazing, the movie making. D.W. Griffith basically created the movie industry. But to give you an idea of the where this movie comes from, the name of the book it's based upon is called The Klansman. And the hero of the movie are not those who ended slavery, but those who kicked out the soldiers for Reconstruction and redeemed Southern rule. The hero was the Klan, who would lead a resurgent South to a new victory, aka the redemption governments. And the villains were former slaves and the United States Army, who enforced Reconstruction. And so you'll notice a couple of things here. First off, actors who in the first era of Hollywood, in fact, this would be the norm all the way up to you'd see this up in the 1950s, who would almost always be whites playing blacks in blackface. That was the norm. Or if somebody played someone who was Asian, it'd be someone who was white who would squint their eyes. That was just the norm. Or somebody playing an American Indian would be somebody who was white with a tan. But here is the Klan finally beating back black misrule. But my favorite part is, doesn't it appear as though the Klan are wearing a bunch of plungers on their head? Those are the heroes of this story. And the President of the United States, a Democrat by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who ostensibly was an historian, he spoke very favorably of this, even though he would walk some of this back, but he would be arguably one of the most racist presidents in American history. And that includes a number of slaves who were, number of presidents who were slaveholders. But to show that this book is the true history, here is a slide. So this is a silent movie, so it has a scene and it has a slide of the dialogue or explanation. This is from Wilson. So this is a quote from Wilson. And Wilson, who watched this movie in 1913 in the basement of the White House at a private screening, who loved the movie, didn't actually formally endorse it, but would say, the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. And so, guess what reemerged after this shockingly popular movie? The Ku Klux Klan. The Klan emerged as those who would fight for true American values. Now, I did not type that in, but get that in, for true American values. And what was that? For whatever a true American might be. White, Protestant. So then it was anti-Catholic, really anti-Jew, on top of being racist against anybody from Asia or Africa, and also anti-Mormon, well, basically anybody who's not a Protestant, a mainstream Protestant Christian. Generically anti-immigrant. It's no coincidence that the Klan would be at its height in the 1920s when the United States would pass its first massive and broad immigration restrictions. It's no coincidence. They were very powerful in both political parties. It depended on where it was at. Like, for example, the Klan was really strong in the Democratic Party in places like Missouri or in like West Virginia. But in Indiana, there were Democrats there. Here they were Republicans. It just depended, whatever party was the dominant party. And I still like to point your answer. You got to admit. And this is going to trigger a massive wave of Confederate monuments after this movie. It's kind of shocking. It's hard to describe what a big deal this movie was. And kind of the reemergence of this glorification of the lost cause. And so you're going to see these monuments all over pop up. The biggest run of monuments will come at the era of the birth of the nation. And yes, they all glorified the lost cause, and monuments like this in Lee Circle, in Richmond, Virginia, were just on the edge of segregated black neighborhoods to make sure anybody leaving that neighborhood would pass a bunch of Confederate monuments. So it was a way to enforce Jim Crow in a way. So these, and the important thing about statues, and this is coming from me, who I like statues for the most part, but they're also, statues are done not so much to remember the past, but as a political statement for today. When the Roman Empire arrived in Gaul, which is now France, they built statues of the emperor, not because they wanted to glorify the emperor, but to make sure everyone knew who's in charge. Just like the Irish immigrants in Montana wanted to slap into the face of the pro-Confederate vigilantes by getting Thomas Francis Meagher's statue. I say, no, we have political power, here's our statue. Well, that's what happened here. By the way, this statue of Lee is now gone, and some have been removed, because these were big political statements. There's a big wave of northern statue building, and that was more 1870s. It's kind of like, we won the war, let's remember the dead. And there's a wave of Confederate monuments in Confederate cities to memorialize the dead in the 1870s. Now, the big statue making is coming later. Yeah. They did that right now. Yeah, I wonder when that was made. Anybody want to guess when that was made? Boy, was this movie popular. So, even before we get to that statue, which you're exactly right, here's a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest in Nashville. Here's the unveiling of it. The guy who was the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. And here's the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Yes, the Klan would meet there yearly, this is in the 1970s, in the state capitol in Tennessee. They literally just removed that statue. Literally. And you can understand probably some bitter feelings about that slapping the face of people who were the victims of the Klan. Yeah.
I went to Nashville, I'm 90% sure we saw that statue, and I'm 90% sure that every time we saw a Confederate statue or something like that, my mom would get it. It's just like, I just look up what it's doing.
Yeah, I could see that, I mean, if you knew why they were built. And that's one thing, if you go to the, like Eastern Europe, they had all those Soviet statues. You would not believe the Soviet Union was big into statues. And what they did with them is when they took them out after the fall of the Soviet Union, they made these big statue parks where they preserved them and kind of told you the roots behind them. And that's kind of what they did with those statues. I don't know what they're going to do with a lot of these statues that are removed. I thought that was a really good idea. I went to one in Budapest, in Hungary. And it was really neat seeing a lot of statues of Lenin going like this. So I always thought that was a good idea to preserve that, but I also see why people would be very upset. Well, this leads to, of course, there's the big building of statues. By the way, you catch you up to the second big growth of statue making. This was because it's anti-civil rights. They built them to show we do not want to get rid of Jim Crow laws, including a massive monument in Georgia at Stone Mountain, bigger than Mount Rushmore, of the faces of all the major Confederate leaders. It's kind of spectacular, but that was finished in the late 1960s. It's huge, still there. And that's Helena. And this was removed by the city commission. When was the date? You see the date? Right? This was proposed in 1914 after the big, the birth of a nation, and it was built after that. Boy, birth of the nation was a big deal. This is the furthest north public monument for the Confederacy was in Helena. But don't forget, Helena was started by a bunch of pro-Confederates. The pro-Confederate vigilantes, 4 draft dodgers, the 4 Georgians were the first ones here. I live 2 blocks away from Davis Avenue, or Davis Street, I'm sorry, which is named after Jefferson Davis. I live 1 block away from Breckinridge Street, which is named after John C. Breckinridge. So we have a lot of Confederate history here in Helena that people don't realize. In fact, I was just talking about that first period, and someone goes, I lived on Davis Avenue. I have no idea. Yeah, Jefferson Davis. And that was removed. It's now in storage, and now it's a big sphere. Yeah. I thought it's a big rubber ball, but it's a big sphere. Yeah, that's it. And this was built in that just kind of fervor. And by the way, this was the same exact time that in Helena, there was a reemergence of the Klan, and that's where Chinese immigrants and African Americans were run out of town. The population went from being about 20% were either Chinese immigrants or black to about 1% in 10 years.
Were they run out of Helena or the state?
Out of Helena, but most of them were Michigan. Yeah. This is a really just racist time all over the world. It's no coincidence you got colonization. I mean, this is all over. And so with that, but I have to get to the most amazing statue ever made, and that too is in Nashville, and that was in Nashville. It literally just came down because weekly for an entire year, someone would throw pink paint on it. So they finally just took it down. But it's the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. But I would say if you want to discredit Nathan Bedford Forrest, I'd leave that thing up. I mean, look at that. All right, so with that, that's also, and that leads to the Gone with the Wind myth. One of the most popular books of the 20th century in the United States with Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. We made it to one of the greatest motion pictures in history. Has anyone seen Gone with the Wind? A couple people? A few? It's a good movie, but it's like, this is just an estimate, but 7 days long, is that about right?
Yeah, so long.
It's about 4 hours. And it was one of the first colorized movies. And actually, there are 2 really big colorized movies in the same year. One wasn't very popular, a movie called, you might have heard of it, called The Wizard of Oz. And then would turn into being incredibly popular down the road. Second semester in special topics, we're going to watch that in the class. Because it's a parable of the populist movement, which we'll get to right after the semester test in here. It's actually a really good historical story. And I think it's a great movie. Even though flying monkeys are terrifying. Yes?
What year was it?
37. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And by the way, to get the color film, they had these big hot lamps all over to make, just enough light. And it was just hotter than heck. And so all the actors were constantly sweating, so I had to stop all the time. Because it was like 110 degrees. And in this movie, the heroes were the plantation owners, the slaveholders. The slaves, how did they feel about slavery in the movie or in the book Gone with the Wind? They fit in with the positive good theory. What was their attitude? Slavery was great. We love it. And they fought side by side with their former masters. The villains were the United States Army. That was the villain. And don't get me wrong. Like during Sherman's March to the Sea, in fact, in every war, there's looting and horrible things happen. But it's implied in the movie that was the goal of the North. No, that was because you're fighting a horrible war. And here, last ever to be seen, the Knights and Ladies Fair, the mass fair of master and of slave. That's a little scrolling at the beginning of the movie. And this is going to become a myth of, the stately plantation homes and that the life of chivalry they led. And if you go to the South, a lot of these plantations, you can go pay money and tour their homes, and they really push this Gone with the Wind myth. And there's always an uncomfortable part. Then what about these slave quarters behind? In fact, that's where you get really uneven tours if you go through this. Now, let's be clear about it. All sections of the country have to deal with this, but it's really noticeable here. It's a good movie, though. I would recommend it, but it is long. Would you agree it's good? But it's just, we're not used to movies this long. We're just, it kind of blows us away. And so with that, this would become so pervasive that it was in every textbook. I wish I could find my old textbook I have in high school, but I can remember this too. Essentially doing this slavery wasn't so bad. I told you about a college professor I did. So here is, how Negroes lived under slavery. And this was a very common high school textbook in the 1970s into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I love, here is the slave arriving. And isn't that pretty much exactly the way the slave ships were when they came in? And they made a business agreement with the plantation owner? Because isn't that what it's implying? Slavery wasn't that bad. And I talked about the laws closer to controlling the Negroes, but the laws weren't enforced. And then they managed their servants according to their own methods. They knew the best way to control their slaves to win their confidence and affection. Isn't that the positive good theory? And that would be the lost cause. So it's no coincidence that I would get a professor who would say this to me, and whatever about him as a person, he was probably taught that. And you see people to this day who are taught that. I mean, this is the norm. This was the norm to be taught that, and I would imagine still is. And that's unfortunate. Because then all of a sudden, wait a second, why are there problems? It would seem so great. I love this. They went visiting at night and sometimes owned guns and other weapons. What? Rule 1 of slavery, you don't give the slaves weapons. Unless you have a nice business agreement here. Look how well dressed they are, though. It's kind of mind-boggling. Well, with that, so what you're going to get then in southern towns is when the Klan emerged, the Klan did not emerge in the South. The South was kind of this genteel racism where everyone had this white citizens council. And so you have little signs like this out front of the town, something about the White Citizens Council of the name of the city welcomes you. And so the thing I got to get is the White Citizens Council. And it was basically elite rule. And when you mentioned the thing about Plessy versus Ferguson, a separate but equal, that really fits in with that part right there. This kind of keeping poor whites, or poor whites didn't have many rights either, so if they were problematic, they couldn't vote. Now, let's be clear about this. You saw similar things in California to, let's say, Chinese or Japanese immigrants. And you saw the same things all over the West, including Montana, about American Indians. But it was much more concentrated in the South. So that's the point here. And, but the Klan, when they emerged, the Klan was big here. The Klan was big in Nebraska, where my mom and dad both grew up. The Klan was big in Montana. And in the North, at this most racist time in history, sundown towns will be established in almost every small to medium-sized town. The Zambonis here! Very jealous of the Zambonis. I want one. Who's with me? I should have a Zamboni. Drive the halls in a Zamboni. You know what a Zamboni is, don't you? Yeah. Zamboni! They used to do it with, they hose it down, and someone scrape it out. And that was always the worst job on the hockey team in Canada. So you know what they call those people who had to do that? Hosers. Moving on. So, sundown towns. And this is where it was mostly, well, you read in history about blacks, but anybody who was not white could not be in these towns after dark. They didn't even write it in their city codes. You can't be in town or you'll be arrested or worse. But it also could be for, in Montana, there's a lot of those for American Indians. But it would also be for blacks too, especially on the railroads. There'd be sundown towns. Because railroad workers could be from all over the United States. And there were anywhere from 10 to 20,000 towns that were sundown towns across the United States. That means, one thing I got to get down and put it there, that means most African Americans who moved to the north in the 20th century, they could only live in big cities. And yes, those neighborhoods would be segregated there. Gil, where are your notes? Okay, let's go. And here's a couple signs. These are in Illinois. This is from a newspaper in Iowa. And my dad grew up in a sundown town. So my dad was born on the Sheriff Roberts Farm south of Louisville. It was in 41 or 42 they moved to Louisville, into the town, the big city of Louisville. About 1,500 people. I know, it's crazy. It was a railroad town. During the war, there was a lot of work on the railroads. They had railroad crews. And a lot of the workers were, a lot of them were immigrants from Mexico or African Americans. And they had a sign outside of this town that said, I mean, this was in Louisville. And he pointed out the sign where the sign was, and going into town, it said, no N-word. No N-word after dark. And that's what it said in the town my dad grew up in. And then it was in 44 that there were some workers who came in and decided to stay at the bar after dark this summer night. They were going to stay out. And they were taken out, a number of them were beaten. And one man who resisted was lynched. They sawed him in half on a barbed wire fence. And that was the town my dad grew up in. And that greatly affected him. That was one of the stories he told me much later on. I told you that. I can't even think about how awful that was, but I think you get the point. That was the same town in 44. So my dad's grandpa, on the other side, he showed up from Ohio. Nobody really knew his background. He didn't tell anybody. He was a partridge. And he was a businessman. He sold dynamite and a bunch of things. He blew up a bridge once by accident. That's another story. But, okay, got in a wreck on the bridge. The car he was in rolled. He flew out. The dynamite exploded somehow because they had the caps too close to the dynamite and blew up the bridge. Yes. So, but nobody knows why, if it was his business practices or what, but he became a target of the Klan because many people thought he was a Jew or a Mormon. And so in 44, they burnt a cross in his yard. He chased them off with a shotgun.
I love your thinking. I would love to just sit down and have a conversation about your experience. This is so fun.
They don't talk to me anymore. No, they do, yes. In fact, I'm talking to my dad tonight. Yeah, Dad told me that story. It's pretty amazing. So that was a Saturday night, and Sunday morning they had a dinner at his grandma and grandpa's house. And the cross would collapse and was, the burnt out log was on, making this big cross was on the yard. And my grandma told him, don't say a word about it. Just cross over it. Just step over it. And so he remembered stepping over this cross. And that night, and there was a couple spots where they threw stuff at him. I kind of like the idea that my great-grandpa chased off the Klan with a shotgun. And I'm going to be very clear about it. I don't like the Klan. I'm just going to say it. And so and so I'm going to be very clear. I don't like these, but this happened right here in Helena. We will come back to what's going to happen in the big cities. So we're going to get to this in a second. So let's get into the West. Because we'll come back to what's going to happen in the 1920s. It's no coincidence that there's going to be an entire summer of attacks of mostly African-American immigrants in the North all over the United States 6 years after the birth of the nation. And there'll be a little bit of a war, and people were going crazy, kind of losing their minds because of a massive pandemic. Hard to believe people would lose their minds and go crazy during a pandemic. I can't believe it. Who would have thunk it? What's that? With Omicron blowing up, food shelf, people are hoarding food. So, yeah, so it's a good time. By the way, Great Falls High is still out. All the schools are out. Yeah, they're all out. 120 teachers went out. It's 20 to 50 times more contagious than the previous coronavirus. If it happens, it happens, right? If it doesn't, this is my finger crossed, hoping it doesn't. Try everyone do it with me together. Don't. Yeah, well, that's good. Let's go. Aaron, you want to graduate? I don't tell me. I can do this. I can't roll my R's, but I can do that.
You gotta like cross the thumbs too.
Huh?
You gotta cross the thumbs too.
Oh, very good. A double whammy.
You gotta cross the
All right. So here's the West, and the last little bit of the West. So this is going to be the final conquest of the West by the United States. And there weren't very many Plains Indian tribes here, but the thing about it is when people talk about the West and the Wild West, what they're really talking about is after the Civil War, or that, right, during the Civil War era, to about 1890, 1900. And it's this area here. Because most of most of the migration from east to west would be to get over this area as quickly as possible and go to here. This was the Great American Desert, people thought. There's these sand dunes, miles of sand dunes in Nebraska. I mean, it looks like the Mojave Desert. I mean, it looks like the Sahara Desert, these sand dunes. It's really weird in Nebraska. And so when Zebulon Pike saw those, he reported sand dunes. Oh, it must be a desert. Has anyone ever seen the sand dunes? It's just very weird. Oh yeah, it's all in this area here. Yeah, so it would be in Kansas, Colorado. It's weird. It's kind of out of place, just kind of a remnants of an ancient ocean. But with this, the first motion pictures, I know Birth of the Nation was about Reconstruction, but the most popular movies, from silent movies all the way up to the 1970s, were westerns about here. A lot of them filmed in Utah. You bring Monument Valleys and those beautiful vistas there. And the most popular television shows from the early days of television in the 1950s to the early 1970s were westerns. In fact, the longest running scripted television show was a western. Yeah. Someone did a first period too. That's a really good guess. And that went on for like 12 years, but it's not the most. Yeah. Robin went up, God, I can't remember how long. It was really popular. Good guess. Want to try one more? Gunsmoke. That's it. Gunsmoke. In Dodge City, Kansas. I kind of like those old westerns. You know, they're silly. What the heck? But I know the words to the theme song of Bonanza because I was bored one day in college. Moving on. So we get to the Plains Indians. Good guess on Gunsmoke. That used to be it was still on. Well, I was born before Gunsmoke. I was born for TV. 28? 21 years? But I think the longest running television show, not news related, is now The Simpsons. Yeah. And scripted show. I mean, that like that's the longest scripted comedy is still on, I think. But the longest scripted show, yeah, still Gunsmoke. So the Plains Indians were the last remaining American Indians that would survive conquest, partially because the United States did not want this. There are significantly more living here or here because of the climate. But remember, they're going to be wiped out not just by colonization in the United States. What killed most American Indians? Disease, this horrific plague that we can't even wrap our minds around. 1% morbidity is horrifically high. I can't even wrap my mind around 90%. 50% was the morbidity during the Black Death. And that is impossible to wrap your mind around. And there's not very many. Because by definition, Plains Indians, because they're nomadic, because they can't really stay in one place, they might farm in river valleys but then move. They have to keep their populations full. Nomadic groups are always have full populations. They have to, just by necessity. And so there's not going to be very many of them. How do we know the European influence by this great painting here? Horse. Yeah, the horse was actually an American animal, but it crossed the same land bridge that people came to the Americans on. And then those very first people ate all the horse. Because horse ate them. Who's that horse? See you tomorrow. Am I the only one who's eating horse in here?
Yeah. That's disgusting.
I would never purposely eat it, but we were in France. They eat a lot of horse, and you want to eat. I want to try as much as I can. I've had dirt. I've had guinea pig. I've had dog.
Is it like a German Shepherd or like a Chihuahua?
18, I think.
You're
I could still
the home of
feel
the
like
Confederate
the vibe
Monument,
of
Confederate
the
Monument.
race.
How much would it cost me to buy it?
Well, the Confederate Association.
And it was so
And
all
the city part of it.
part of it.
Like,
And it was just weird. And then we toured a couple plantations in Belgium, I think. And that was fascinating. But even I was like 12 years old, so we was like 12 years old, and I could still feel like the glorification of the South. And they were just like, and these are the slave quarters. But look over here, look at the plantation and how pretty it is. And then you look at the slave quarters, and it's literally just like a box, like this big. Oh my God, it was so bad.
Yeah, it's a 4x4.
Yeah, it was awful.
And the cities will put more money in areas, especially for tourists, but also. Yeah, I really don't. I believe it. Yeah, I've been to a lot of plantations before. I've been to a lot of really See you tomorrow. It's lunchtime.
I know, but I don't know what time fourth period actually starts. Because
And that's when the bell rings. You get here before that.
the last time I didn't came in really early.
I'm all messed up.
It's off.
Yeah.
You want to eat after 4.
We've been trained to eat after 4. But the thing is, I was not going to get there. Even though I still like my money. Yeah. Burger? How is it? Good. Delicious. Oh, we gonna watch
Day in the universe.
I love it. I love the Day of the Universe, Janie, so much. So good.